Hello everyone and welcome to our special webinar on unlocking the benefits of a CIBC RDSP. I'm Dave Evangelisi, Senior Director, CIBC Savings, Investing and Advice. I'm a white male with dark brown hair and today I'm wearing a gray suit with a light blue shirt. It's a pleasure to be your host today. Joining me is Jamie Gollenbeck, Managing Director, Tax and Estate Planning, CIBC Private Wealth. Jamie will share his expertise and answer your questions about disability tax credit and the Registered Disability Savings Plan. Many of you may recognize Jamie from his weekly National Post column and regular media commentary. He is widely regarded as one of Canada's most respected voices in tax, estate, and financial planning. Jamie has also been advocating about the benefits of the RDSP since its launch in 2008, and met with the late Minister Jim Flaherty to encourage various reforms to the rules, which have since been adopted. We're especially grateful for Jamie's time today and for the valuable perspective he'll bring on how you or a family member with a disability can leverage the benefits of an RDSP along with Canada Disability Savings, grants, and bonds as part of your personal financial planning. During his presentation, Jamie will provide information on the requirements to qualify for the disability tax credit, as well as the details and benefits of the Registered Disability Savings Plan. If you have any questions, we encourage you to participate in our live Q&A at the end of our webcast. To submit a question, hover over the Q&A icon in the upper right corner of your screen, type your question, and select Submit. We'll do our best to address as many questions as possible. Thank you, Jamie, for joining us. Let's get started.
That's great. Thanks, David. So my name is Jamie, and I'm sitting here today. I'm a white male with glasses, and I'm wearing a white shirt and a gray suit. And I'm going to share with you in about 20 or 25 minutes what you need to know about the RDSP, the Registered Disability Savings Plan, and how to qualify and what some of the basic rules are. Now, these plans are advanced. They are complex. We will try to get to as many questions as we can today, but sometimes they go beyond what we can answer, in which case we'll refer you to our website, in which I've written a couple of articles on planning for RDSPs, as well as a much more advanced planning with RDSPs. It goes into a lot of the more complex technical rules. So let's jump in. To be able to open up an RDSP, presumably you or someone in your family has a disability. And the disability has to be such that you qualify for the disability tax credit. So to qualify for the disability tax credit, you must be either markedly restricted in at least one of the basic activities of daily living. So those are walking, feeding, dressing, speaking, hearing, mental functions, or eliminating. Or be significantly restricted in two or more of the basic activities of living, or need what's called life-sustaining therapy. Now, in addition to those requirements, your impairment must be prolonged and has lasted, or at least is expected to last, for at least 12 months or longer, and is present all or at least substantially all of the time, which has generally been interpreted to be 90% of the time. Now, in recent years, they've expanded the definition of the mental functions for disability, and perhaps as the years go on, we'll see more applications that may have been rejected in the past now being allowed by the Canada Revenue Agency. So that is kind of the first step. To be able to open up an RDSP, you must have a disability tax credit. Now, how do you get the DTC? How do you apply for this? So you complete most of the form online. There is a T2201 form, but a medical practitioner is still required to fill out Part B of the form. Now, which medical practitioner depends on the type of disability that you have. So for example, if it's a vision disability, if you're blind, for example, then you could use a medical doctor, a nurse practitioner, or an optometrist. If you had a marked restriction in one of the various other areas, like speaking or hearing or walking, you can see on this screen a list of the medical practitioners that are qualified to complete Part B of the disability tax credit form. Now, once you've completed the form, you can send the form to the CRA for approval. Now, this can actually be done electronically. You don't need a printer. You don't need to print it out and mail it in. It can be submitted electronically using the CRA My Account system, or of course it can be printed and mailed to your tax center. Sometimes your medical practitioner may get a supplemental questionnaire from the CRA asking them to complete some additional questions about the disability. Now, in the past, CRA has often denied applications that are either incomplete or they've not been correctly completed. And sometimes there's a lack of substantiation, or sometimes there's even contradictions within the application. So again, you've got to be very careful with that application form, but if done properly and sent in, you should be able to get an answer from the CRA, hopefully within a few months. Now, this is the digital form online. This is a relatively recent thing. All the instructions are online on the CRA's website, and it's quite easy to complete on the digital form. There's also, of course, other methods to fill in as well if you're unable to do it in digital format as well. Now, let's jump into the actual RDSP. What is a registered disability savings plan? So assuming you've got the disability tax credit, does the RDSP make sense for you or for your family member with a disability? So an RDSP is a tax-deferred plan to save for someone with a disability. You're only allowed to have one RDSP per beneficiary. So that's very different than all of the other registered plans. So you can have multiple RSPs, you can have multiple TFSAs, you can even have multiple FHSAs. You're only allowed to have one RDSP. But the RDSP doesn't have to be the only registered savings plan that you have. You could also perhaps save for an individual with a disability, not necessarily just with the RDSP, but also with the RESP, the Registered Education Savings Plan, if that individual may be pursuing post-secondary education in the future. So who can be a beneficiary? So what is the beneficiary of the RDSP? The beneficiary is the individual living with a disability. That's the person that ultimately will receive payments from the RDSP. To qualify, they've got to be eligible for the disability tax credit, as we explained. They've got to be a resident of Canada. They must have a social insurance number, and they must be 59 or under in the year the RDSP is opened. And that's something that's very important to keep in mind. We often do get questions from people that are 60 or older. You cannot open up your RDSP at that point. It's got to be done in the year you turn 59 or earlier. Many of our clients have been setting up RDSPs for their minor children when they're diagnosed with a severe and prolonged disability. So the next question is, who can actually open up the RDSP? In other words, who is the plan holder? So the role of the plan holder of the RDSP is the person who opens up the account and makes decisions about the use of the funds, how they're invested, and when they're paid out. So you can have a joint holder. So typically if you've got parents that are opening it up for a child, they can be joint holders of an RDSP. If a beneficiary is under the age of majority, and of course that depends on the province, 18 or 19, or even if they're over but they lack the capacity to enter into a contract, then the plan holder can be the parent, the guardian, or a public agency acting for the beneficiary. If the beneficiary is of the age of majority, so 18 or 19, depending on the province, and they're contractually competent, then at the time the RDSP is opened, they must be their own plan holder. Now, once the RDSP is opened, they can become the plan holder, and in fact, they can either be the sole plan holder or be a co-plan holder with the parent or guardian that originally opened up the RDSP. If there is some doubt about whether or not they have the competency to enter into a contract to open up an RDSP, then under a temporary rule till the end of 2026, either the individual's spouse, common law partner, or even a sibling, a brother or a sister, could open up an RDSP on their behalf. How do contributions to RDSPs work? So you can make a contribution to an RDSP up until the age you turn 59, And the maximum contribution that you can put in during your lifetime is $200,000. Now, there's no annual limit, but there are maximum annual limits to the government grants that you're going to be able to receive. And we'll talk about those in just a second. Now, unlike an RRSP or a first home savings account, you do not get a tax deduction for contributions to the RDSP, but the benefit is that all the income and growth earned in the RDSP are all completely tax deferred until the money comes out of the RDSP. Now, contributions can also be made by people other than the plan holder, so other relatives, for example, that want to contribute to, let's say, a child's disability savings plan, but you'll need written consent of the plan holder to allow this. So what can an RDSP invest in? So generally, there's a list of qualified investments, which is very similar to RSPs, RIFs, and TFSAs, which can include, depending on the type of RDSP, securities, mutual funds, and deposits. At CIBC, our RDSP offers a wide variety of mutual funds, depending on the appropriate investment strategy that you would like to have for your particular RDSP. Now, of course, the biggest benefit of RDSPs, depending on the age of the individual, is the ability to get free money in the form of government grants and government bonds. Let's spend a bit of time understanding how much you can get, and when you can get that money. So let's start with the Canada Disability Savings Grant, or the CDSG. And what the CDSG is, it will match your contribution to the RDSP based on certain percentages that we'll go into. So you can get these disability grants up until the year the individual with disability turns 49. The maximum you can get in a lifetime is $70,000, with the maximum grant in a particular year being $3,500. Now, the amount of grant the individual is entitled to is income tested, and it's based on family income of the second preceding year. So, for example, for 2025, it's based on 2023 family income. If the family income's over $114,000, there is a restriction of disability savings grants that's limited to only $1,000 a year. However, there is a carry forward, and you do have the ability, as we'll explain in a few minutes, to retroactively get back the grants for up to 10 years, to a maximum of $10,500 annually. We'll take you through some examples of how that might actually work. So the other type of government benefit is the Canada Disability Savings Bond, or the CDSB. Now, the nice thing to remember about the CDSB is those are available to you without having to make any contributions of your own money at all to the RDSP. There's a maximum lifetime amount of CDSBs of $20,000 and a maximum annual bond of $1,000, and these are also income tested. They're based on family income of the second preceding year. And again, for 2025, you'd look at the 2023 family income. If your family income is below $37,487, you get the full $1,000. If it's between $37,000 and about $57,000, you'll get a prorated amount of the $1,000. But if the family income's over $57,000, then you will not get any of the disability savings bond. Now, again, there is a carry forward. It can be retroactive for up to 10 years. But again, you've got to apply this as part of the RDSP program. And if you're not sure what your entitlements are, there is a statement of entitlement that is sent by the Employment and Social Development Canada annually for both the grants and the bonds. Another important point to remember is when we look at family income, typically if the person's under the age of 19, we're looking at typically the parent's family income. However, once you are over 19 years of age, you're looking at the individual with disabilities family income. And that's why in some cases you may be able to get those grants later into your when you're in your 20s or even beyond, even if you didn't qualify based on family income before that. So just to summarize how the grants work, there are two levels of grant. There's a 300% grant and a 200% grant. So the rules say then the first $500 that you can contribute to an RDSP, you get a 300% grant. So on 500, you get $1,500. And then the next 1,000 that you can contribute every year, you will get a 200% grant. So 1,000 means 2,000. So a typical strategy might be that if you can afford to do it, putting in $1,500 a year for 20 years it would give you the opportunity there to put in the 30,000 and you can get the maximum grant. So we're looking at $3,500 a year every single year for 20 years. If you did that strategy, you'd get up to the $70,000 maximum. Now the disability savings bonds, remember you don't need to make any contribution to get the $1,000 annual CDSP. And again, you can do that for 20 years and you've got $20,000 of disability savings total. So in total, we're talking about $90,000 of potential government benefits. Now, if we take a look at an example, if we put in $1,500, we're going to get $3,500 plus $1,000. That's $4,500 from the government, $1,500 from you. That is a total of $6,000. So if you can put in $1,500, you could get up to $6,000. And that doesn't even include prior year retirement entitlements. And this is where it gets a little bit tricky. So let me try to explain this on a very basic level. And if you need more information, certainly you can go online because we actually go through this in detail on our RDSP materials. So let's take an example here of Miles. Miles is eligible for the disability tax credit starting back in 2012, but he only opened up an RDSP in 2025. We'll assume a low family income for the purposes of income testing. So the eligibility for 2025 is the current year, 2025, plus 2015 to 2024. So in other words, we can go back the 10 years. So it's $500 a year at a 300% grant amount for the full 11 years, so 10 years retroactive, plus 1 year currently. And we can go back and get 10 years worth of bonds plus the current year. So that's another 11 years of bonds. So in other words, our total eligibility for grants and bonds is $38,500. Sorry, let me just backtrack a second because this can be confusing. We're actually talking about the grants here. So remember, there's two levels of grants, right? There's the 300% grant and the 200% grant. So on the disability savings grant, the eligibility is 11 years at 300% and another 11 years at 200%. So it's a two-tiered grant system. So when we're looking just at the grants, it's $38,500, but there is a maximum cap of $10,500 per year. So if we're just looking at the grants for a moment, assuming that we're putting in $3,500, the good news is that the government will actually allocate the contributions to the earliest year's maximum award first. So in this case, we go back from 2015 to 2021, we'd get $500 at 300%, times 7, you get your $10,500 of grants. And this is a sort of a great opportunity, the CGSG. So we'd get, if we put in our, contribution here of $3,500, and we get $3,500, our $3,500 and $10,500 from the government, we're actually getting $14,000 on our $3,500 contribution. So that is the carry forward. Now, what happens next year for 2026? So again, this can get very, very technical. So don't worry if you don't follow all these numbers. But again, next year it shows you that we could get another $10,500, because what we're effectively doing, without going through all the details of the math on this slide, is we're actually going back and we're getting the $500 grants at 300%, and then we're getting some of the $1,000 amounts at 200%. So in other words, we're able to eventually catch up and get retroactively the grants that we missed. So again, this is one of the biggest benefits of opening up the RDSP, is assuming that the individual was qualified for the disability tax credit for the prior years, they'll be able to catch up and get back retroactively the grants. So let me come back again to this concept of family income. So again, until the end of the year that the beneficiary turns 18, family income includes the income of any parent or guardian. But once the year the beneficiary turns 19, we only use the income of the beneficiary or their spouse or partner if applicable. And that applies even if the beneficiary continues to live with their parents. So one possible strategy would be, if the family income is so high that you don't get the additional grants, you only put in $1,000 a year up until age 19, which gives you the $1,000 match. But after that, you can go back retroactively and start claiming the Canada Disability Savings Grants for future years. So remember, this is based on income from 2 years prior. So it's very important to file tax returns for the beneficiary and also for the parent or guardian to show the qualification. Now, here's just a quick example of a family that put in $1,500 a year for 20 years to max out. So that's $30,000 of contributions. That's represented by the red bars. They would get the maximum grant match, which is $70,000. They'd get the maximum disability savings bond match, which is another $20,000. And assuming a modest rate of return of just 3% over 20 years, you'd have growth of $46,000. That is a total balance in the RDSP after 20 years of $166,000. That's equivalent to a 14.5% rate of return. And the nice thing is that this potentially could come out completely tax-free. Contributions always come out tax-free, but anything else, the growth, the grants, the bonds, are taxable to the individual with disability. Once you add the basic personal amount and the disability tax credit, they may be able to receive another $25,000 of income a year without paying any tax whatsoever on the RDSP withdrawals. Now, if you're in a higher family income situation and you started, let's say, for a child age 1 up to age 20, you put in $20,000 of contributions, you're only going to get a match on 100% of $1,000. So you're going to get $20,000 of disability savings grants. You don't qualify for the bonds. But even in this scenario for a higher income family, the balance at the end of 20 years using a 3% return is just over $55,000. And again, equivalent to an 8.9% effective rate of return. In many cases, will come out tax-free. Now, I've just shown a bunch of models. Without going into all the details, I have the charts sort of at the bottom that sort of go through some of the math here. But I'm saying that even if a family has high income up to age 18, as I suggested earlier, and then of course you're using the individual with disability and maybe their income is lower from age 19, we're talking about a scenario where we can catch up. We put in the $200,000 over time, and we catch up. We get all the grants and all the bonds. Even with those, relatively modest rates of return, we can accumulate about $2.6 million over a lifetime at age 60 when it's time to take money out of the RDSP. Similarly, if we do it even up to age 40, we can accumulate just over $1 million with a modest rate of return, assuming that we're able to put in the maximum and get the maximum grants and bonds. So it is complicated, I admit, but the nice thing is that the government actually has a disability savings calculator. So you can actually go onto the website and the RDSP site, and you can actually punch in your situation and look at the grants and bonds that you might be able to get and put in your family income, and you can go from there. So that's kind of the contributions, and those are the grants. What else can be done with RDSPs? So another opportunity is, let's say you've been saving for an individual that's living with a disability in an RESP, a Registered Education Savings Plan. So if you have someone who's the beneficiary of an RESP, but is also the beneficiary of an RDSP, so there's a common beneficiary, and you meet one of these conditions, in other words, there's a mental impairment that prevents the individual from going to post-secondary education, or the RESP has been around for at least 10 years and all the beneficiaries are at least 21, or the RESP has been around for 35 years, you could actually transfer the income and growth from the RESP into the RDSP. That's a contribution, so it reduces the $200,000 lifetime maximum, but it does not count as a contribution for the purpose of the disability savings grants. Another opportunity is parents could decide to leave their RSP or RIF to a financially dependent child or grandchild's RDSP. And so ultimately, what could happen is you could get a rollover between the deceased RSP or even RIF, as long as it's done within 60 days after the year of death. Again, this counts as a contribution to the RDSP, so you've got to make sure you have sufficient RDSP contribution room, but it will not count as a contribution for the purpose of getting the disability savings grants. Now finally, let's talk briefly about withdrawals. I can tell you the rules are complex. There are two types of withdrawals. There are the disability assistance payments. There's a lifetime disability payments as well. The bottom line is that payments are made out ultimately to the beneficiary. There may be a maximum amount that is allowed to be paid out. There's a complex formula that we discussed in our bulletin. You may be required to make payments annually starting at age 60. And the way it works is part of each withdrawal, part of it will be taxable and part of it will be non-taxable. There's actually a formula that allocates the ratio of contributions to the ratio of the grants, the bonds, and the income in the account. And the one thing to keep in mind is there is also a potential to have to repay amounts to the government that you've received from the grants and bonds if you withdraw money from the RDSP too early. So once you start at age 60, it's not going to be a concern, but there is something called the assistance holdback amount for the CDSGs and CDSBs. That's any bonds or grants that have been deposited in a 10-year period prior to withdrawal. You actually have to repay on a ratio of 3-to-1 if you take out anything within 10 years of agreement. Now, there are very detailed exceptions for shortened life expectancy, but this is something to keep in mind. Now, if you keep the RDSP open for a lengthy period of time, let's say until age 60, because really that's what it's meant for. It's meant to provide a source of retirement income for someone living with a disability, then because you cannot get any grants or bonds after age 49, from age 49 to 59, there's a 10-year window. You start taking it out at age 60, and there is no required repayments of grants and bonds. And finally, the good news is that when you take money out of the RDSP, that withdrawal, even though it's considered to be income in the hands of the individual with disability, it does not affect their entitlement to government benefits on the federal side. So there's a quarterly GST-HST credit, there's Canada Child Benefits, Old Age Security, employment insurance. That is not considered to be income for federal purposes. When it comes to the provinces, you really do have to check with your own province. The rules do vary by province, whether you live in Ontario or Alberta. The rules do vary, and there could be either a full or partial exemption from the income or assets in an RDSP from eligibility to receive provincial support. So I think with that, I'm going to just finally refer you to the website. We're going to try to take some of your questions. So we have two websites, CIBC.com. If you go onto our main website, there's an area called Smart Advice. And if you click on Smart Advice, there's tax tips. Under tax tips, we have an area of registered plans. And in that section, you're going to find both articles that our team has written on registered disability savings plans. One's called Planning with RDSPs. And the other one, if you really want to get into some of the more complex nuances of withdrawals and the formulas and lifetime DAPs and things like that, there's something called Advanced Planning with RDSP. That's over 10 pages, and that's certainly something you could look at. And finally, I also have my website, jamiegolomic.com. Every article I've written for the National Post is there online, 25 years of material. So feel free, if you're interested, for more information on how RDSPs fit in with other types of planning for individuals with disabilities, such as Henson Trust and other types of planning vehicles, check out my website. It's all searchable as well. So I think with that, Dave, I'm going to stop talking and happy to take some of our viewers' questions.
All right, thanks, Jamie. That was great information. So now it's time to get to your questions. As a reminder, to submit a question, hover over the Q&A icon in the upper right corner of your screen, type your question and select Submit. We've already had quite a few really good questions, so let's get started. First question is from Greg. Does an RDSP have any negative implications for a family plan RESP?
Yeah, so again, the RDSP is pretty distinguished from the RESP. So I would say no. In other words, many families will set up a multi-beneficiary RESP, Registered Education Savings Plan. And what they'll do is they'll contribute typically $2,500 a year per child to get a matching 20% Canada Education Savings Grant, so they get $500 a year. There's no reason why you cannot do the RESP contributions in addition to the Registered Disability Savings Plan contributions. In fact, I would argue that they serve two very different purposes. The RESP is meant for an individual's post-secondary education. When you take it out when they're enrolled in school, then the money is taxable to that individual. I like to think of the RDSP as more of a long-term strategy. What you're trying to do with the RDSP is you're trying to set aside money for the retirement, ultimately for the long-term benefit of an individual living with a disability. So typically speaking, depending on how much you contribute to the RDSP, you may be required to start taking money out at age 60, and you must take out a lifetime amount based on a formula sort of every single year thereafter. So think of RDSPs as a retirement plan. It doesn't have to be a retirement plan, but that's the way I like to think about it. Sort of a longer term savings plan for someone with a disability, but think of the RESP as a very specific purpose. It's meant for post-secondary education.
Okay, thank you. Next question is from Brenda. What happens to the fund when a beneficiary dies without a will?
So again, typically speaking, in an RDSP, if a beneficiary dies, the assets in the RDSP will fall into the estate of the beneficiary. Now, if the beneficiary has a will, it will be divided according to the will. Otherwise, the beneficiary is dying what we call intestate, meaning without a will. And again, the rules for intestacy vary by province, and there's a list of what happens if someone dies without a will in every province. And I would consult your provincial law. There's an ordering of who gets the money. It could be the parents, children, spouse, other relatives. There's a whole a list of ordered or preferential relatives. So that's typically what happens. In most situations, if there's still bonds or grants that have been paid in the previous 10 years, those must be repaid to the government. But the rest of the money, the income, the growth, the contributions, all belong to the beneficiary. And I think there's an important distinction that people don't understand that's very different than the RESP. So with a registered education savings plan, if I contribute towards my children's RESP, the contributions are actually mine. I'm always allowed to get back my contributions. I may have consequences of repaying their government grant, but with an RESP, the contributions belong to the subscriber of the RESP. The RDSP is very different. With the RDSP, once you put the money in there, this belongs to the beneficiary. So you really want to think about that. This is money I can afford to give away. This is money I want ultimately for my child or a relative, and you can't get it back. So good question.
Thank you. Next question is from Scott. What happens if you apply for and receive RDSP benefits, but then you become well and lose a disability certificate? Do you owe back the benefits?
So this is a great question, and there was a recent very, very positive change. And this is some of the lobbying that we've been doing for over a decade on the RDSP. It used to be a big problem that if you, let's say, apply for the disability tax credit, you qualify, you start saving for, let's say, a child with a disability, and then they get better. And all of a sudden the disability after 10, 15 years goes away, and they no longer qualify for disability tax credit. It used to be you'd have to close up the plan and pay back you don't have to do that anymore. What you can do is you can keep the RDSP open. You do not have to repay the government grants or bonds. You're not entitled to make any further contributions, and you're not going to get any further grants or bonds. And the good news is, if you can keep that plan open till age 60, when the 10-year period between sort of 49 and 59 occurs, then in fact, you'll be able to keep all the grants and bonds. The rule basically says that there's actually a formula that if you try to take the money out, you're going to have to repay back 10 years worth of grants or bonds. So general advice is, and again, there's certain rules for shortened life expectancy, but the general rule theory would be that with the disability tax credit eligibility, if you're no longer eligible, if you can afford to do it, keep the money in the RDSP. And if you wait from age 49 to 59 and don't touch the money, starting at age 60, you'll be able to take out that money and not have any requirement to repay the grants or bonds. We actually discussed this in our Advanced Planning with RDSP bulletin.
Okay, great. Thanks again. Next question is from RJ. Is it better to prioritize contributions to an RDSP versus an RSP or TFSA? If it depends on income tax brackets, can you give examples? For example, if you're in the lowest or second lowest tax bracket, which account type is best to prioritize?
Okay, so this is a great question, and this comes up all the time. How do you prioritize between all the different savings vehicles? We even have, RESPs and FHSAs. There's just so much to contribute. Look, they all serve different purposes. We have to keep in mind that with an RDSP, you don't get a tax deduction for your contribution. What you're doing is you're giving after-tax dollars typically to your child or relative that's living with a disability. So you really got to think about the big picture. And where does it fit in with your own prioritization and your own goals? So if your goal is saving for retirement, for your retirement, then you're going to prioritize either RSPs or TFSAs. And then we go back to the basic theory. If you're in a high tax rate now, and you're going to be in a lower tax rate when you retire, you're going to favor the RSP because you get a tax deduction today at a high rate, and you have an income inclusion later at a lower rate. If, on the other hand, you're in a relatively low tax bracket now, and you might be at a higher tax bracket when you retire, you're going to want to do your TFSAs, pay tax on your income first, put the after-tax money into TFSA, so that when you take it out later in retirement, it's going to come out tax-free. So that's where I would say. But the broader question, this is a question I think that the viewer is asking, is how does the RDSP fit in? And think about the RDSP as a way of leaving an inheritance in a tax-efficient manner to be able to support a relative or a family member with a disability, typically once they're age 60, depending on the amount of bonds and grants in the plan. They may be able to access the money earlier as well. But really, you're looking at two different strategies. One is your own retirement, and one is setting aside money, perhaps an inheritance of some dollar amount to someone with a disability. And that's kind of how I would balance the two. I would say, what are my goals? My goals are obviously to save for retirement, maybe save for kids' post-secondary education, maybe save for a first home using the FHSA, and ultimately set some money aside for a family member with disability that may need those funds later on in life. And that's where the RDSP can come in really handy.
Yeah, great. Some great advice. Thank you. Next question is from Debbie. Also another good question. How do we incorporate the RDSP into our state plan when the plan is to be activated to start payments for our adult child regarding taxes?
Yeah, so RDSPs sort of come into the picture when you sort of look at ultimately the withdrawal strategy. And again, it will depend on the type of RDSP that you have. There may be a minimum age where you're going to start paying things out, at 60, a lifetime annual amount. You have to remember that with the RDSP, part of each payment will be taxable and part of it will be non-taxable, depending on the ratio of contributions to other stuff being grants, bonds, and income or growth in the RDSP. So again, I would incorporate the RDSP strategy as part of a plan for the individual that has that disability. What projection? Do a plan. Sit down with a financial advisor and look what are all the income needs of that person, that individual, when they reach, let's say, the age of retirement. And then look at the government assistance that's available to them. Look at the various tax credits, like the basic credit, the disability tax credit. Look at the new Canada disability benefit that's available to individuals over the age of 18. And when you put that all together into a plan, you can sort of incorporate the RDSP withdrawal strategy and also get an estimate of sort of the contribution ratio to income and determine how much tax might be on that. And then you can be strategic about the amounts that you could withdraw up to certain maximums that may apply depending on if it's primarily government-funded RDSP.
Okay, thank you. We have a lot of good questions. This is another one that's related to estates. Questions from Brent. I'm currently the executor of my father's estate. I need to open a Henson Trust for his disabled child. I'm also considering opening an RDSP. As a brother, will my high tax bracket be an issue for the RDSP and government grants?
So typically not. Typically we look at the age of the beneficiary, so it depends on how old that beneficiary is. Again, judging by this question, it sounds like the beneficiary might be over the age of majority. I don't know for sure, but if they're 18 or 19, depending on the province, or in fact, from an income testing perspective, if they're 19 years of age or they turn 19 this year, the income of the supporting person is irrelevant. So it should not be an issue in terms of the government grants or bonds. There may be issues if it's a legal guardian, but again, I think in this case you'd be safe depending on the age, because ultimately we use that individual's own family income, not the income of the typically parent, but in this case the parent's passed away.
Okay, yeah. Great. Next question's from Jared. In regards to people who become disabled later in life, is there any program that you could recommend for people over the age of 60 in regards to savings, plans, and trusts?
Yeah, so again, good question. So again, remember that the RDSP is really meant, in fact, is only meant for people under the age of 60. You cannot open up, unless you've opened it up before, you cannot open up an RDSP after age 60. So if someone is 60 and looking at, sort of tax savings, for most individuals, there are a variety of tax plans that already exist that people are just not maximizing. So whether it's an RSP, if you have earned income, do you have RSP carry forwards to be able to maximize, catch up on prior year's RSP contributions? But if you have no earned income, the tax-free savings account, the limit this year is $7,000. The cumulative limit is $102,000. That's also something I would consider in terms of being able to, sort of save money in a tax-free manner, even beyond age 60. And then you want to make sure that you are taking advantage of all the different non-refundable credits on the tax return. We've talked about the basic personal amount. Again, that's around $16,000 a year. The disability tax credit, it's another $10,000. And there may be, depending on the type of disability, medical expenses that qualify for the medical expense tax credit. So, you could be looking at, a significant amount of credits each year, which means that, even if you do have some income, they can all be sheltered with the use of those non-refundable credits. So I think it's a good idea to maybe sit down with either a tax advisor or someone who helps prepare your return and sort of walk through what that might look like for someone over 60 in terms of trying to look at all the different tax-effective vehicles, whether it's TFSAs, RSPs, or ultimately just using tax credits to eliminate taxation of income.
Yeah, some great advice again, thank you. Yeah. Next question from Greg. Can a U.S. citizen be a plan holder of an RDSP?
So this does come up from time to time. So it's a lot more complicated when you have a U.S. citizen. And the reason for that is that U.S. citizens are, of course, required to file a U.S. tax return, even if they live in Canada. So I assume that we've got a Canadian resident. They qualify for disability tax credit, but they're also a dual citizen, or at least they're a resident of Canada and a citizen of the U.S. They certainly can have the RDSP, but the problem is that the RDSPs are not recognized as a tax-deferred plan in the U.S. And that means a couple of things. First of all, it means that any income or growth would be taxable each year, right? So it's not exempt. And the second thing is that there's reporting. So typically speaking, depending on who you talk to, these RDSPs are considered to be, from the U.S. tax perspective, foreign trusts. And therefore, there may be a requirement to file what's called a 3520 or a 3520A in respect of either contributions or at least the existence of the RDSP. So I would say tread carefully there. It may still be beneficial, because again, the grants are $70,000, the bonds that's $90,000 of free money. So what if you have to file an extra form every year? It's easy for me, I'm not paying you for it. But I mean, this is something that you need good advice. So presumably if you are a US citizen, you're filing US returns, I would reach out to a US tax advisor and say, look, just like other US citizen clients living in Canada, certainly they have RSPs. There's a debate whether they should have a TFSA. Even RESPs can be more complex, but ask them about the RDSP, because there may be requirements certainly to disclose and to report the income. But again, that's something that's more complex, and you should obviously speak to your US tax advisor if you're a US citizen and wants to open up an RDSP.
Next question from Stan. Is it beneficial to try and make the RDSP a non-primary government-assisted plan as opposed to a primary government-assisted plan as soon as financially possible, meaning the beneficiary has contributed more than the $90,000 into the plan before 59 years of age?
Yeah, so I think that's generally a good strategy. And then this is, getting into some of the more advanced nuances of the RDSP. The problem of having a primarily government assistance plan is that there are very strict rules in terms of withdrawals. Whereas if it's a plan where the individual has put in more money versus the government in terms of the $90,000 of grants or bonds, the rules are more relaxed in terms of the withdrawal requirements. So I think generally that can be a good strategy, depending on all the other considerations that you might be looking at in terms of prioritization of other registered plans. If you can afford to do it, then yeah, I think it can work well.
Okay. We're getting some really good questions here.
Yep.
Next one from Sierra Merg. I have a DTC approval from 2019 to 2029, but I opened my RDSP only last year and haven't contributed much yet. If I make contributions now, am I eligible to receive the retroactive Canada Disability Savings Grants for the years I've missed? And will those retroactive grants come in at the maximum rate of up to $3,500 per year until I catch up to all the years I'm eligible for?
Well, the simple answer is yes. I mean, I don't have all those details in front of me because we're just sort of doing this in real time live. But yes, that is exactly the plan. Once you open up that particular plan and you qualify for disability tax credit, you should be entitled to retroactively get those grants. And remember, those grants are paid out first at the 300% rate. And then once you've caught up on the 300% rate, then the 200% rate, the maximum that you can get in 1 year on a carry forward basis is $10,500. So again, it's something to worth. I would go online to that website that we shared, which was the Disability RDSP Grant Calculator. You can Google that. It's very easy to find online. And then actually, I would enter your specific situation online, and it will actually calculate how much you need to contribute to catch up and fully catch up on those missed grants.
Right. Next question from Dave. Can you clarify family income for the grant income testing in terms of a blended family and shared custody, i.e., is it the household income of the new blended family, or is it just the income of the bio parents?
Yeah, so this is a great question. This comes up in all kinds of contexts in federal income tax law, and it's actually the combined family, right? And this has been an issue. We've seen people discuss this issue in the past, and people have said it's very unfair because sometimes the non-biological parent or the step parent or whatever you want to call it is not contributing in any way. And yet their income is included. And then that's very true. So technically speaking, what happens, at least my understanding, is that when you file a tax return and you're now living common law or married to that, let's say second spouse who's not the biological parent, when you file that return, those two social insurance numbers are linked. And therefore that family income is now included together, and all income testing is done on that basis. So this can pose potentially a limitation in terms of being able to get the maximum amount of grants.
Thanks, Jamie. Next question from Kamal. If you have an RDSP with BMO and mutual fund and we want to transfer to another bank, would there be any additional cost or risk?
Yeah, so again, I mean, people do this all the time. If it's appropriate to you, certainly, you can move an RDSP from one institution to the other. In terms of the fees, that's something you need to check with BMO. Need to check, whether there are fees in terms of transferring from one institution to the other. But there's no risk. In fact, all the information is brought over by law. So all the history of grants and bonds and your entitlements to future grants or bonds, that'll all be carried over electronically in the background. So certainly at CIBC, we accept RDSPs from other institutions, and we're very happy to do that.
Okay, well, thank you, Jamie, and thank you to everyone who joined us today. Unfortunately, we didn't have time to get to everyone's questions. But really appreciate everyone that did submit a question. We hope today's discussion provided valuable information and advice about financial tools that can help you or a family member with a disability. At CIBC, we're committed to helping you stay informed and empowered through events like this, connecting you with our experts and timely advice to help you make confident financial decisions. If we didn't get to your question today, or if you'd like to discuss how the Registered Disability Plan can support your financial plan, please reach out to your CIBC advisor or call us at 1-800-465-3863. Thank you again, Jamie, and thank you to everyone who participated.